The morning was quiet, almost too quiet. A soft wind rustled through the rows of tombstones, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. The cemetery seemed peaceful, almost sacred, each stone telling the story of someone who had given everything. It was the kind of silence that made people stop and think, a silence that demanded respect. The guard walked slowly between the graves, his boots making soft impressions on the gravel paths. Every step felt deliberate, measured, like a rhythm in tune with the solemn surroundings. He had walked these paths many times before, but each morning felt different. Sometimes he thought about the lives behind the names etched on the stones. Each one had a story, a family, friends who missed them dearly. Some of the soldiers had been young, barely older than teenagers who had faced unimaginable dangers. Others were older, veterans who had lived long lives but had still given their last breath for their country. The guard felt a deep connection to them. It wasn't just a job, it was an honor. He carried the weight of that responsibility quietly, without needing anyone to notice. The cemetery had a certain rhythm. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and sometimes squirrels darted between the graves. The wind occasionally carried the sound of distant traffic, but it seemed muted here, like the world outside didn't exist. The guard liked it this way. It gave him a chance to think, to reflect. He had served in the military himself, though his days on the battlefield were behind him now. Yet the lessons he had learned there stayed with him. Discipline, awareness, and a respect for life that never faded. Today, something felt different. As he walked along one of the narrower paths, he noticed small signs of disturbance. A few leaves were out of place, as if someone had brushed past in a hurry. A piece of trash lay awkwardly near a tombstone, unusual for such a well-kept place. He paused, crouched slightly, and observed quietly. His instincts told him to pay attention. Years of training and experience had sharpened his senses. Even in a place that seemed peaceful, he knew that trouble could appear suddenly without warning. He continued walking slowly, scanning the surroundings. The sun was climbing higher, its warmth beginning to fill the cool morning air. The cemetery looked almost golden in that light, the edges of the tombstones catching the glow like tiny beacons. He could see names, dates, and small messages carved into the stone. Some had flowers placed neatly beside them. Others had small tokens like coins or miniature flags, symbols of remembrance left by family members and friends. Each one seemed to speak silently, telling the story of courage, sacrifice, and love. As he rounded a corner, he noticed a faint sound in the distance. It was too rhythmic to be random, too lively to belong to the wind or animals. At first he thought it might be joggers passing by, but the sound was sharper, more deliberate. He stopped, crouching slightly behind a larger tombstone to observe without being seen. His eyes narrowed as he tried to make out the shapes in the distance. It looked like a group of people moving together, laughing and talking loudly, their voices carried across the cemetery, breaking the quiet in a way that felt almost disrespectful. The guard's heart sank slightly. He could sense that they were not here to honor the fallen. There was a careless energy about them, an arrogance that seemed to ignore the solemnity of the place. They carried something with them. He could not tell exactly what, but it looked like spray paint cans or markers. His instincts tightened. This was the kind of behavior that could escalate quickly if not addressed carefully. He stayed still, watching them from a distance, trying to understand their intentions before making a move. Time seemed to slow as he observed. Each step the group took was deliberate, confident. They moved from one row of tombstones to another, pointing and laughing at the inscriptions, mocking the very stories of sacrifice that surrounded them. The guard's jaw tightened. He had seen disrespect before, but this felt different. It wasn't just casual thoughtlessness. It was deliberate. They seemed to be testing boundaries, daring someone to stop them. And he was that someone. He reminded himself to stay calm. Acting too quickly could provoke them, and he did not want the situation to escalate into violence. He had to be strategic, measured, just like he had been trained for. Every small detail mattered, the way they moved, the sounds they made, the distance between each person. He noted all of it quietly, keeping himself hidden while assessing the best way to intervene. The guard remembered the stories of soldiers who had protected their comrades in the field. They did it not for recognition, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. He felt the same responsibility now, though the battlefield was replaced by rows of stones and memories. These people had given their lives and he owed them respect. Protecting the cemetery was not just his job. It was a duty, a silent promise to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. As he continued to observe, he felt a mixture of anger and sorrow. Anger at the group for their disrespect, and sorrow for the lack of awareness they showed. They didn't understand the weight of history, the sacrifices behind each name, the lives that had been lived and lost. And yet he also felt a strange sense of calm. He knew what had to be done and he trusted in his own judgment. He was not here to shame them unnecessarily. He was here to protect and preserve. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The group drew closer to the older tombstones, the ones most likely to be defaced. The guard's pulse quickened slightly, but he did not move from his hiding spot. He watched as one of them pulled a can of spray paint from a bag, shaking it carelessly. Another laughed and pointed at a name engraved on a stone. It was clear that they intended to leave their mark, to impose their presence where it did not belong. The guard took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was the moment that required patience and clarity. He had to act not out of anger, but with precision and authority. His presence alone could stop them if he played his hand correctly. He reminded himself that sometimes the most powerful action was the one that did not escalate into conflict. He was ready to step forward when the time was right, but for now he remained unseen, a silent protector in the morning light. He thought about the families of the fallen, those who might visit these graves later in the day. They would expect respect and peace, a place to honor their loved ones. He could not allow the actions of a careless few to destroy that. His role, though quiet and often unnoticed, mattered more than they could ever understand. Each decision he made in this moment carried weight, and he embraced that responsibility fully. As the sun climbed higher, casting stronger shadows across the rows of tombstones, the guard prepared himself. He knew that the next moments could define the day, and perhaps the memory of these tombstones for years to come. His eyes remained fixed on the group, analyzing every movement, anticipating their next step. He felt the solemnity of the cemetery around him, the silent presence of those who had sacrificed everything, and in that silence he found strength, clarity, and purpose. He would not let this moment pass unnoticed. He would protect the honor of the fallen, the peace of the cemetery, and the dignity of every stone that marked a life lived with courage. And when the time came, he would step forward, not with anger, but with the quiet authority that commanded respect. For now he waited, calm and vigilant, fully aware of the responsibility he carried in his heart. The quiet of the cemetery was shattered by the sound of laughter and footsteps that grew louder with each passing moment. The group of teenagers, or maybe young adults, the guard couldn't tell exactly, had moved closer. Their voices carried through the morning air, rough and careless, with no hint of respect for the sacred place they were in. The guard stayed crouched behind a large tombstone, his eyes scanning their movements carefully. They didn't notice him yet, and he intended to keep it that way for as long as necessary. They carried backpacks, and from the bulges inside, he could make out cans of spray paint and markers. The guard's heart sank. It was one thing to be loud and foolish, but it was another to actively deface the graves of those who had given everything. Each step they took, each careless glance they threw at the stones felt like a small punch to the dignity of the fallen. He knew that if they were left unchecked, they could leave marks that might take months, maybe even years, to restore. The group moved as a unit, joking and shoving each other lightly, unaware of the watchful eyes upon them. One of them laughed loudly, gesturing toward a cluster of older tombstones near the center of the cemetery. The guard recognized the area immediately. It was where some of the most decorated soldiers were buried, the kind of people whose names should be spoken with reverence rather than mocked. He felt a mix of anger and determination. This wasn't the time for confrontation yet, but he knew he needed to act before things got worse. He observed closely, taking note of each individual's behavior. One of them was reckless, bouncing from one stone to another, pointing at inscriptions and smirking. Another had a spray can in hand, shaking it roughly as if preparing for mischief. Their arrogance was palpable, their sense of invincibility almost tangible. The guard remembered his own younger days, though he had never been so disrespectful. Youth could be careless, but there was a line that should never be crossed. They were stepping over it now, oblivious to the weight of history around them. The guard's training kicked in naturally. He had faced situations in the military where observation and patience were more important than immediate action. He remained hidden, letting the group move closer, making sure he understood their patterns and potential threats. He noted the way they handled the paint cans, the way they laughed when one of them tripped slightly on the gravel. Each detail mattered, because it would determine how he approached them when the time came. As the group neared the older tombstones, their behavior grew bolder. One of them crouched down to examine the engraving on a particularly distinguished soldier's stone. He laughed and nudged his friends, pointing at the text and making crude jokes. Another pulled out a marker, uncapping it with a sharp snap that echoed through the cemetery. The guard's jaw tightened. This was no longer just careless behavior. It was deliberate. They intended to leave their mark, to make their presence known in a place where they did not belong. The guard's mind worked quickly. He had to weigh his options. Confronting them too soon could provoke a negative reaction. Calling for backup would take time. He needed a strategy that would assert authority without escalating the situation. His presence alone could command respect, but only if used correctly. He remembered lessons from the field: timing, patience, and clarity of purpose. Every moment he waited was an opportunity to prevent disaster without violence. He continued to watch as the group split slightly, two moving toward the larger, more prominent tombstones while the others stayed near the edges. Their laughter became louder, more thoughtless. One of them lifted a can of paint and sprayed lightly on the edge of a stone. It was faint, but enough to mark the beginning of disrespect. The guard's eyes narrowed. He could not let this continue. The time to act was approaching, but he remained calm, letting the group underestimate him. The tension in the air grew almost tangible. The birds had quieted, the wind had slowed, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath. The guard felt a strange sense of duty mixed with anticipation. He had faced danger before in his life, but this was different. There were no weapons, no battlefield, yet the principle was the same. Protect those who could not protect themselves, honor the lives that had been given, and prevent needless destruction. This was his mission, and he would carry it out with the same discipline and focus that had guided him in the past. One of the teenagers tripped slightly over the gravel, almost knocking over a small bouquet of flowers left at a grave. He laughed, brushing himself off, and the others joined in. The guard's patience was tested, but he stayed still, observing. Each action, no matter how small, was important. They didn't know he was there, and that gave him an advantage. He could step in at the right moment and assert authority without fear. He thought about the families who might visit later that day. They would expect peace, respect, and a chance to honor their loved ones. They would not expect a group of careless youths defacing stones, leaving disrespect in their wake. The guard felt a surge of protectiveness. He could not allow that to happen. His role, though often invisible, mattered deeply. Each step he took to preserve the cemetery's dignity was a step toward honoring the sacrifices of those who had given everything. The group continued their reckless behavior, moving from one stone to another. One of them knelt beside a particularly old gravestone, examining the name and dates, laughing as he made crude jokes. Another grabbed a can of paint, shaking it aggressively, preparing to leave a mark. The guard's heart raced slightly, but his face remained calm. He was not here to act out of anger. He was here to assert control and restore order. He began to move quietly, positioning himself so that he could step out at the right moment. His movements were slow, deliberate, careful not to alert the group. He calculated the distance, the timing, and the angle. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. He knew that when he finally revealed himself, it had to be with authority that could not be ignored. The group needed to understand immediately that their behavior was unacceptable. As he approached, he kept his voice low, almost a whisper to himself. He reminded himself that anger was not the tool here. Presence and authority were.
He had learned this lesson in the military, in situations where showing restraint was often more powerful than force.
The guard felt a deep sense of purpose. These stones represented lives, sacrifices, and memories. Protecting them was a responsibility he would not take lightly. The group had now reached the center of the cemetery, near the tomb of a soldier with many accolades. The one with the spray can began to move closer to the engraving, preparing to mark it. The guard felt the moment had come. He straightened slightly, his posture commanding yet calm. He stepped forward. his uniform and presence immediately catching the group's attention. For a brief second, there was silence. The group froze, not expecting anyone to confront them. The guard's eyes met theirs, steady and unwavering. He spoke in a calm but firm voice, reminding them of the dignity of the place and the importance of respect. His words were measured, carrying the weight of authority and experience. The group hesitated, unsure how to respond. This was a turning point. The guard's presence alone was enough to shift the balance. The group could see that he was not someone to be ignored or mocked. They had underestimated him, and now they realized their mistake. His calm authority, his clear understanding of the situation, and his unwavering focus commanded respect. They paused, uncertain whether to continue their mischief or back away. The guard remained composed, letting the silence hang for a moment, allowing them to absorb the gravity of the situation. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats. His presence, demeanor, and words were enough. The group slowly began to step back, their confidence faltering. They had not anticipated being confronted in such a controlled, firm manner. The guard stayed alert, watching them as they retreated toward the edge of the cemetery. He followed at a distance, ensuring they left without causing further damage. His mind remained focused on the task at hand, protecting the tombs, honoring the fallen, and maintaining the peace of the cemetery. Once they were gone, he would assess any damage and take the necessary steps to restore the area. Even as they disappeared from sight, the guard remained vigilant. He knew that respect for the fallen was a responsibility that required constant attention. The cemetery was more than a place of stone and earth. It was a repository of stories, memories, and sacrifices. Each person buried here had given something irreplaceable, and it was his duty to ensure that those sacrifices were honored, not mocked or ignored. The group lingered near the center of the cemetery, their careless laughter filling the quiet space. The guard kept his distance, moving slowly and deliberately to keep an eye on them without revealing himself too soon. He noticed their confidence had grown as they wandered among the tombstones, perhaps thinking that no one was watching. That confidence made them dangerous in its own way. They had no respect, no awareness, and that kind of recklessness often led to bigger mistakes. One of them knelt beside a particularly old and decorated gravestone, tracing the letters of the inscription with his fingers, smirking at the name and dates. Another held a can of paint, shaking it aggressively, ready to leave their mark. The guard felt a surge of anger rise in him, but he held it back. Anger would not help. He needed control, patience, and authority. He reminded himself of the soldiers he had served alongside, those who had faced real danger and had acted with precision and calm. He needed to emulate that same discipline now. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and soil. It seemed to whisper reminders of the solemnity of the place, but the group ignored it entirely. They were oblivious, their focus entirely on their own amusement. The guard crouched slightly, watching every movement, noting the patterns of behavior. He needed to anticipate what they would do next. One careless step, one thoughtless spray of paint could cause damage that might take months to fix. As he observed, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. These stones were not just markers of lives. They were symbols of sacrifice, bravery, and honor. Protecting them was not merely a duty, it was a calling. Each person buried here had given something irreplaceable. Some had fought on battlefields far away, facing danger and death with courage. Others had defended their communities, their families, their country. And now their memory was threatened by a group of careless youths who did not understand the gravity of what they were doing. The guard reminded himself to stay calm. He had faced situations in his past where patience had been the key to resolving danger. Acting too quickly could provoke confrontation. He needed to time his intervention perfectly, ensuring that it would stop the group without escalating the situation. He shifted slightly, keeping his movements silent, blending into the background while maintaining a clear view of the group. The group split into two pairs, moving in different directions among the tombstones. One pair headed toward a cluster of older, more prominent graves, while the other lingered near the edges, occasionally laughing and pointing at inscriptions. The guard noticed the body language of each person, their mannerisms, and even their expressions. One of them seemed more reckless than the others, almost daring to test boundaries. The guard's instincts told him that this was the one who could escalate the situation if not watched closely. The guard's mind ran through possible scenarios. What if they started vandalizing the most decorated tombstone? What if they tried to challenge him when he stepped forward? He considered each possibility carefully, planning how he would respond to each. His training had taught him that control came from awareness, not from force alone. His presence could command respect if used wisely. He needed to demonstrate authority, but in a way that would not provoke them into defiance. As he prepared to intervene, he noticed subtle signs that the group was becoming bolder. One of them had already started to leave faint marks on a stone with a marker. Another had gestured toward a particularly decorated gravestone, clearly preparing to spray paint it. The guard felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of anger and urgency. This was the moment that required calm, clarity, and precise action. He could not let them cause irreversible damage, yet he needed to maintain control of the situation. He thought about the families of the fallen, those who might come later that day expecting peace and quiet. They deserved the opportunity to honor their loved ones without witnessing this disrespect. The guard's resolve strengthened. Protecting the cemetery was more than a job, it was a moral duty. Each tombstone represented a life, a story, a sacrifice. He would not allow those stories to be defaced or forgotten. The group's noise grew louder, their laughter sharper and more careless. One of them tripped slightly over gravel, nearly knocking over a small bouquet left at a grave. He laughed and brushed it off, and the others joined in, mocking the seriousness of the place. The guard's patience was tested, but he stayed hidden, observing. He knew that revealing himself too soon could provoke an unpredictable response. Timing was everything. He remembered his training, the lessons learned from years in the military. Situational awareness, patience, authority, these were the tools he needed. He positioned himself so that when he finally stepped forward, he would command attention immediately. His uniform, his presence, and his calm demeanor would speak louder than words alone. The group would have no choice but to recognize the seriousness of their actions. The guard began to move silently, adjusting his path to stay concealed while keeping the group in view. Every step was deliberate, every motion calculated. He focused on the leader of the group, the one holding the spray can. That person's arrogance made him the most dangerous. If he could assert authority over him, the rest would follow. The guard's mind worked quickly, planning the words he would use, the posture he would take, and the timing of his approach. As he drew closer, he observed the small details that others would overlook. The way one person fidgeted with a backpack, the way another's eyes darted nervously when they thought no one was watching. He saw the subtle signs of insecurity beneath their bravado. These details gave him confidence. He could use his presence to guide them away from their destructive behavior without resorting to confrontation. The group's attention was entirely on the tombstones, laughing and joking as they prepared to leave their mark. One of them lifted a can of spray paint, shaking it roughly, preparing to deface the stone. The guard knew that if he waited any longer, it would be too late. He straightened slightly, making sure his posture was confident yet calm. This was the moment to step forward, to assert authority without aggression. He emerged from behind the tombstone slowly, letting his presence be felt. The group froze, surprised by the sudden appearance of someone in uniform. The guard's eyes met theirs, steady and unwavering. He spoke calmly but firmly, reminding them of the dignity of the cemetery and the sacrifices of those buried there. His voice carried authority, experience, and purpose. The group hesitated, unsure how to respond. The silence that followed was powerful. The guard did not raise his voice, did not make threats. His presence alone conveyed the seriousness of the situation. The group realized that they had underestimated him. Their confidence faltered, replaced by uncertainty and hesitation. The guard's calm, controlled demeanor was enough to shift the balance entirely. He took a small step closer, maintaining eye contact. The group began to step back, unsure of whether to continue their mischief or leave. The guard's steady presence and clear authority had commanded respect without any need for confrontation. He allowed the moment to stretch, ensuring they fully understood the gravity of their actions. Slowly, the group began to retreat, moving toward the edge of the cemetery. The guard followed at a distance, ensuring they did not attempt any further vandalism. His focus remained on protecting the tombs, preserving the peace, and honoring the memory of the fallen. Once the group had left, he would assess the situation and take the necessary steps to restore the cemetery. Even as they disappeared from view, the guard remained vigilant. He knew that respect for the fallen was a responsibility that required constant attention. The cemetery was more than a collection of stones. It was a living memory, a place where stories of courage and sacrifice were honored. Protecting that memory was a task he carried with pride, patience, and unwavering dedication. The guard stepped fully into view, his presence calm but unmistakably firm. The group froze instantly, their laughter dying in mid-air. For a moment they didn't speak, unsure what to do. The sight of him in uniform, standing tall among the tombstones, made them realize that their carefree mischief had met a serious obstacle. They had expected no one to care, no one to notice. They had been wrong. His eyes scanned each person carefully, taking in their expressions, their body language. One of them tightened his grip on the spray can, unsure whether to continue or retreat. Another glanced nervously at the older tombstones, perhaps recognizing for the first time the sacredness of the place they were about to deface. The guard's calm demeanor carried authority, and they felt it immediately. This was not someone to joke with or ignore. He spoke clearly, his voice low but firm, carrying a weight that commanded attention. He reminded them that these tombstones represented lives given in service and sacrifice. He spoke of the soldiers' bravery, of the families who had lost loved ones, and of the respect owed to those who could no longer speak for themselves. Each word was deliberate, measured, carrying both moral authority and quiet power. The group shifted uncomfortably. Their bravado faltered under the guard's gaze and words. The one with the spray can hesitated, unsure whether to act. The others looked to him for guidance, but even he seemed uncertain now. For the first time, they realized that their actions had consequences beyond what they had imagined. The guard's presence reminded them that some boundaries were sacred, and crossing them carried weight. He moved slightly closer, still calm, still deliberate. There was no rush, no aggression. His posture, his tone, and the steady gaze made it clear that he was in control. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten them physically. His authority came from presence and moral clarity. That alone was enough to shift the balance. The group took a step back, unsure what to do next. The guard's eyes never left them. He watched as the young man with the spray can lowered it slowly. Realizing that the moment for defacement had passed, another turned to look at the tombstones they had nearly marked, perhaps seeing them for the first time as symbols of real lives, not just names on stones. The air in the cemetery seemed to hold its breath, heavy with the weight of the moment. He spoke again, calmly reinforcing the importance of respect. He reminded them that the cemetery was not a playground, that each tombstone carried a story of courage, and that carelessness here dishonored not only the fallen, but themselves. His words were not anger, nor were they judgmental. They were a reminder, a firm guidance meant to correct thoughtless behavior before it caused real harm. The group looked at each other, uncertainty replacing their previous confidence. The one who had been most aggressive now glanced at the ground, avoiding eye contact. Another whispered something to a friend, their tone subdued. The guard could see that they were beginning to understand, slowly realizing the weight of their actions. He stayed still, allowing the silence to reinforce his message. His presence was more powerful than any shouted reprimand could have been. Minutes passed. The group slowly began to retreat, their energy deflated. Their previous laughter and bravado had vanished, replaced by awkward shuffling and nervous glances at the tombstones around them. The guard kept his distance, following them subtly to ensure they did not attempt any further mischief. His eyes remained fixed, alert to every move, every possible action they might take. He thought about the soldiers whose graves they had approached. He thought about the families who might visit later that day, expecting quiet and reverence. The thought strengthened his resolve. Protecting this space was about more than stopping mischief. It was about preserving dignity and honoring sacrifice. Every step he took to maintain order was a tribute in itself. The group reached the edge of the cemetery, hesitating briefly as if expecting a challenge. The guard's calm, authoritative presence gave them pause. Slowly, almost reluctantly, they turned and left, their earlier confidence gone. The guard allowed them to go, confident that their lesson had been learned. They had seen firsthand that disrespect carried consequences, and that some boundaries were never to be crossed. Once they were out of sight, he took a deep breath and looked around. The tombstones were mostly intact, though a few showed signs of minor disturbance. A small bouquet had been knocked over, and there were faint marks where the spray had nearly touched the stone. He moved carefully among the graves, straightening flowers and making notes of what needed attention. His work was not yet done, but the immediate threat had passed. As he worked, he reflected on the events of the morning. The encounter had reminded him why his role mattered so much. It was not just about guarding a cemetery. It was about honoring lives, preserving memories, and upholding respect for those who had given everything. His presence had made a difference, and he felt a quiet sense of pride in that knowledge. The air in the cemetery slowly returned to its peaceful state. Birds began to chirp again, and the wind rustled the leaves gently. The guard walked slowly along the rows of tombstones, ensuring everything was in order. He paused at the gravestones of particularly decorated soldiers, taking a moment to pay silent tribute. Each name, each date, each story carried weight, and he honored them in the quiet way he knew best. He also thought about the group he had confronted. They had been young, careless, and unaware of the impact of their actions. The guard hoped that this encounter had taught them something valuable, that they would carry the lesson of respect beyond the cemetery. He believed that discipline and calm authority could guide even the most thoughtless individuals toward understanding, and he felt satisfaction knowing he had acted wisely. The morning light grew stronger, illuminating the cemetery in a soft golden glow. The guard's shadow stretched across the gravel paths as he moved from one row of tombstones to another. He felt a sense of connection to every person buried here, a silent promise that he would continue to protect their memory. Each stone, each name represented courage and sacrifice, and he was determined to honor that in every action he took. He paused at the edge of the main path, looking back at the central area where the encounter had occurred. Everything was calm again, peaceful as it should be. The group had left and the tombstones remained dignified, their stories intact. The guard felt the weight of his responsibility, but also a quiet satisfaction. He had faced a challenge without anger, without force, and had upheld the dignity of the fallen. As he continued his rounds, he reflected on the nature of courage. It was not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it was quiet, firm, and deliberate. Sometimes it was the presence of a single person who understood the weight of responsibility and acted with integrity. That kind of courage mattered as much as any heroic deed on a battlefield. It protected memory, honor, and respect. By the time the morning had fully transitioned into day, the cemetery was serene once again. The guard finished his round, checking each row, each stone, and each flower. Everything was in place, preserved as it should be. He felt a deep sense of peace knowing that he had fulfilled his duty, not for recognition, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. The guard took one last look at the tombstones, the rows stretching into the distance, each one telling a story of sacrifice. He knew that his role, though often invisible, was vital. Protecting these lives and memories was a responsibility he carried with honor. The morning's events had tested him, but they had also reaffirmed the importance of vigilance, patience, and moral authority. After the group had left, the cemetery slowly returned to its quiet, peaceful state. The guard walked among the tombstones, inspecting each one carefully. A few showed minor signs of disturbance, and he gently straightened flowers and small tokens left by family members. He made mental notes of the areas that might need more attention later, ensuring that every grave maintained its dignity. Even small details mattered here. Every stone represented a life, a story, and a sacrifice that could never be replaced. The guard paused at one of the older tombstones, reading the inscription with quiet reverence. He imagined the life of the soldier who lay beneath it, courageous, disciplined, committed to a cause greater than himself. It reminded the guard of why he was here, why he took his role so seriously. Protecting this space was more than a job. It was a moral duty. Each moment spent guarding the cemetery was a moment spent honoring someone who could no longer defend themselves. He walked slowly along the gravel paths, his boots making soft impressions in the dirt. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, carrying a sense of calm and reflection. Birds chirped in the distance, and sunlight streamed through the branches, illuminating the rows of tombstones in a warm, golden light. It felt as though the cemetery itself was breathing, returning to the serenity it deserved. The guard allowed himself a small moment to absorb it, knowing that this peace was fragile and required constant vigilance. The encounter with the group lingered in his mind. They had been careless, unaware, and disrespectful. Yet the guard did not feel anger toward them. He felt a quiet satisfaction that he had handled the situation with patience and authority. He had intervened without escalating conflict, relying on presence and calm command rather than force. That, he believed, was the true demonstration of courage and responsibility. He thought about the lessons the group might carry with them. Perhaps they would remember the quiet authority, the unwavering gaze, and the firmness in his voice. Perhaps they would understand, at least in part, that some boundaries should never be crossed. The guard believed that respect could be taught through action as much as words, and he hoped that this encounter had left an impression. Even small moments of understanding could shape people in ways they might not immediately realize. As he continued his rounds, he reflected on the lives represented by the tombstones. Some had died young, barely old enough to experience life fully. Others had lived long lives, but their final act had been one of sacrifice. Families had mourned, communities had honored them, and the country owed them a debt that could never be repaid. The guard's role was to uphold that honor, ensuring that every visitor to the cemetery could feel the respect and dignity that these soldiers deserved. The morning had turned to midday, and the light had grown stronger, casting long shadows across the rows of graves. The guard paused at a particularly distinguished tomb, its inscription worn with age but still legible. He felt a connection to the person who rested there, imagining the bravery, the struggles, and the moments of quiet courage that had defined their life. It reminded him that every stone carried a story, and every story was worth protecting. He thought back to the group he had confronted. Their laughter, their careless movements, and their sense of invincibility were still vivid in his memory. Yet he understood them as young people, untrained in the ways of respect and discipline. The encounter had been a teaching moment, whether they realized it or not. He had shown that authority could be exercised calmly, firmly, and effectively, and that actions could speak louder than words. The guard reflected on his own journey, the experiences that had shaped him, and the discipline that had guided his actions. He remembered the training, the moments of fear and courage, the times when presence and awareness had saved lives. All of that experience now found purpose in the cemetery, in his quiet vigilance, and in the protection of those who could no longer speak for themselves. He continued walking, inspecting each row, each stone, each token left by families and friends. Some stones were decorated with small flags, others with flowers, and some had coins placed carefully by visitors. Each item told a story, a sign of remembrance and a tribute to lives that had mattered deeply. The guard moved with care, ensuring that these symbols of respect remained undisturbed, preserving the dignity of the cemetery. As he finished his rounds, he paused at the entrance to the central path, looking back over the rows of tombstones. The sun reflected off the stones, making them gleam softly in the light. The cemetery, once threatened by carelessness, had been restored to its solemn peace. The guard felt a sense of quiet pride, knowing that his vigilance had made a difference. He had acted with calm authority, ensuring that respect and honor prevailed. The guard reflected on the broader meaning of his actions. Courage was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it was quiet, deliberate, and measured. Sometimes it was standing firm in the face of disrespect, protecting memory and dignity without raising a hand in anger. That kind of courage mattered deeply, for it preserved the legacy of the fallen and set an example for those who might follow. He thought about the families who might come later that day, expecting a place of peace to honor their loved ones. They would find the cemetery as it should be, quiet, dignified, and respectful. The guard's actions had ensured that their moments of remembrance would not be interrupted by carelessness or thoughtlessness. That, he knew, was a small but meaningful victory. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of flowers and damp earth. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the sunlight streamed through the branches, casting gentle shadows across the tombstones. The guard felt a sense of calm and connection. He was not alone. He was part of a larger story, one of service, sacrifice, and remembrance. Every action he took in that cemetery honored those who had given everything, and he felt that responsibility deeply in his heart. He paused at one last row of graves, taking a moment to reflect. Each stone represented a life, a family, a story of courage. The guard silently promised that he would continue to protect this place, that he would remain vigilant and attentive, ensuring that the dignity of the fallen would never be compromised. He knew that his role, though often unseen, was vital. Each day he served here was a tribute to those who could no longer defend themselves. As the day wore on, the cemetery remained serene. The guard completed his rounds, checking every path, every stone, and every token of remembrance. The morning's events had been challenging, but they had also reinforced the importance of his duty. He had faced disrespect with calm authority, prevented damage, and preserved the honor of those who had given their lives. The cemetery was once again a place of peace and reflection, a sanctuary for memory and respect, finally. The guard stood at the edge of the cemetery, looking back over the rows of tombstones stretching into the distance. He felt a quiet satisfaction and pride. His actions had protected lives, memories, and stories. He had intervened with patience, awareness, and moral authority, showing that respect and dignity could be maintained without anger or force. In the silent cemetery, he had made a difference. As he walked away, he carried with him the knowledge that his presence mattered. The tombstones remained intact, the memories preserved, and the dignity of the fallen honored. He had acted not for recognition, but out of a deep sense of duty, understanding that true courage often manifests quietly, with steadfast commitment and unwavering respect. The cemetery, peaceful once again, stood as a testament to lives given, lessons learned, and the power of vigilance, presence, and moral authority.